It's basically how much fish you produce per unit of input, whether that's land, water, energy, or even labor.
So being smart about your resources is not only good for your wallet, but for the environment too.
Exactly. And the more efficiently you use resources, the better your financial gains and the smaller your environmental footprint. It's a win-win.
A whole new era of communication in the global aquaculture industry is coming. Now you have the brightest minds in aquaculture right in your pocket. And what's best? You can listen to all of them while driving to a farm, traveling, or running errands. It's never been this good, and it's never been this simple. Welcome to the Aquaculture Podcast Show, the first AI-based podcast in aquaculture, where you'll find cutting-edge insights in everything that's working in aquaculture, nutrition, health, and production.
Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty crucial for everyone in U.S. catfish aquaculture. We're taking a close look at a recent study that really digs into resource productivity and cost efficiency on catfish farms.
Yeah.
You know, trying to glean insights from real-world data, stuff you guys can actually use.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about understanding how different production systems impact your bottom line, right? How they affect how you use resources and ultimately your farm's economic performance. That's what we're going to unpack.
Right, and the scope of the study is impressive, honestly. They analyzed 38 farms across Arkansas, Alabama, and Mississippi. It's a lot of ponds, like 325 to be exact, and they covered 9 different production strategies, both for channel and hybrid catfish.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty substantial data set, which makes the findings that much more valuable, right? But the fact that they were dealing with real farm-level data, not just some theoretical models, gives you a much clearer, more practical picture of what's actually happening out there.
I mean, that's the whole point, right? Getting a real-world view of how things work. And one of the things that really jumps out from the study is this strong connection they make between economic sustainability and environmental sustainability.
Yeah. They really emphasize how those two are actually intertwined, not separate goals. And the key metric that ties them together, the thing you really want to maximize, is resource productivity. It's basically how much fish you produce per unit of input, whether that's land, water, energy, or even labor.
So being smart about your resources is not only good for your wallet, but for the environment too.
Exactly. And the more efficiently you use resources, the better your financial gains and the smaller your environmental footprint. It's a win-win.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the study itself. How did they go about collecting and analyzing this mountain of data from all these different farms?
So they gathered data on a whole bunch of production factors, everything from stocking densities and feeding practices to pond configurations and aeration protocols. But here's the key thing. To make sure they were comparing apples to apples, they standardized all the major economic variables, like land costs, labor wages, and interest rates, using national averages.
I see. So they sort of leveled the playing field, taking into account regional differences in costs so that they could really focus on comparing the efficiency of the farming systems themselves. Makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. And this study actually builds on some previous work by Kumar and his team back in 2020. It kind of takes that analysis to the next level, digging deeper into how resource productivity directly translates to cost efficiency in different U.S. catfish farming environments.
So what were some of the specific metrics, the key performance indicators or KPIs that really provided the most valuable insights into resource use and cost efficiency?
Well, a few really stood out. First, there's land productivity, which is basically how many kilograms of fish you produce per hectare of land. And, when you look at the numbers, split pond systems were the clear winners, reaching a whopping 17,037 kilograms per hectare. That's huge.
So if you're looking to really maximize your output from the land you have, split ponds seem to have a significant advantage.
Absolutely. And that higher yield translates directly into lower land costs per kilogram of fish produced. It's just more efficient land use. Then you've got water productivity, which is measured as kilograms of fish per hectare of water surface. Again, split ponds were top performers, reaching over 19,000 kilograms per hectare. Even those intensively aerated hybrid systems, they showed pretty significant improvements in water use efficiency compared to the more traditional methods.
So both land and water resources are being utilized much more effectively in these more intensive systems.
Yeah, that's a big takeaway from the study. Then there's energy productivity, which looks at kilograms of fish produced per gigajoule of energy used. It's all about how efficiently you're converting energy input into actual fish production. And again, split ponds, along with those intensively aerated ponds, were the most energy efficient, producing around 476 kilograms of fish per gigajoule.
That's impressive, especially considering that some of these systems require more aeration, which obviously uses energy.
Right, exactly. So seeing those high energy efficiency figures is pretty significant. Now let's talk about labor and management. They measured this as kilograms of fish produced per full-time equivalent, or FTE, of labor and management. What they found is that the larger farms, particularly ones using split pond systems, had higher labor productivity. This means lower labor management costs per kilogram of fish produced.
So bigger farms and more intensive methods lead to better labor efficiency. Classic economies of scale at work, right?
Yeah, pretty much. And when it comes to capital productivity, which is basically how much fish you get for every dollar invested, it followed a similar pattern. Larger farms with those intensive systems, like split ponds and hybrid catfish production, they showed higher capital productivity. And here's an interesting point this study made. They found that higher initial capital investments actually tended to lead to bigger production and efficiency gains down the line.
So even though there's that upfront cost, being strategic about capital investment seems to pay off in the long run. Makes you think, huh. Now, feed is obviously a major factor in any aquaculture operation. What did the study have to say about feed conversion ratio, or FCR, across these different systems?
Well, that was interesting. They found that FCR didn't really vary that much between the different production systems. It was pretty consistent. But here's the catch. Feed costs are still the biggest operational expense, regardless of what system you're using.
So while intensive systems might be more efficient in other areas, they're not magically solving the feed efficiency problem.
Exactly. It's a challenge across the board. Optimizing feed efficiency is still the holy grail, no matter what kind of system you're running. Now, when you directly compare the traditional low-intensity ponds to the more technologically advanced split ponds and aerated systems, the difference in performance is pretty stark.
And am I right in saying that the intensive systems basically came out on top in terms of most of these key metrics?
Yeah, pretty consistently. Whether you're looking at land use, water use, energy efficiency, labor productivity, or even capital productivity, those split ponds and aerated systems just outperformed the traditional methods. It's a pretty compelling argument for their potential to really boost efficiency in U.S. catfish farming.
Speaking of boosting efficiency, let's talk about the economic side of things, specifically economies of scale. How do those play into the advantages of these more intensive systems?
Well, with these intensive setups, you can generally have higher stocking densities and overall production, right? You're producing more fish within the same footprint, basically. And that means your fixed costs, like management overhead and certain capital expenses, are spread out over a larger volume of fish, which brings down your per unit production cost.
Yeah, so you're essentially producing more fish for a proportionally smaller cost, which is a pretty fundamental economic principle. But does this put smaller producers at a disadvantage?
Well, that initial capital investment needed to set up something like a split pond system can be a pretty big hurdle for smaller farms, especially when resources are tight. Plus, managing these systems is often more complex. They require a higher level of technical expertise, which might not be accessible to everyone.
So there's a trade-off, right? The potential for long-term efficiency gains versus the upfront costs and the need for more specialized knowledge. But even with all these potential efficiency improvements, we keep coming back to feed costs. Seems like that's the nut we still haven't quite cracked.
Yeah, and that's despite the relatively consistent feed conversion ratios across all the systems. So even with advances in other areas, the fact that feed remains such a dominant cost factor just highlights how important it is to keep pushing for improvements in feed formulations and feeding strategies. Even small improvements in FCR can make a big difference in the overall economics of catfish farming.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what's the bottom line? What's the main takeaway about resource productivity and cost efficiency in U.S. catfish farming?
Well, based on this study, the evidence is pretty clear. Those more intensive catfish farming systems, particularly split ponds and intensively aerated ponds, they just have better resource productivity and cost efficiency. The way they use land, water, energy, labor, and capital, it's all more efficient.
And for our listeners, how can they actually use these findings and these specific metrics to improve their operations?
Those key performance indicators, things like land productivity, water productivity, energy productivity, they offer a really practical framework for assessing and comparing different production strategies. You can use them to really crunch the numbers, identify areas where you can improve, and figure out if switching to a more intensive system makes sense for your operation.
It's all about having that data-driven approach to decision-making, right? Being able to make those informed choices that ultimately lead to a more efficient and sustainable industry. So for our final thought, given that intensive systems offer all these efficiency advantages, where do we go from here? What kind of research and development efforts do you think are most crucial to finally address this feed cost challenge in these high-output systems? That's the big question, the next frontier, I think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the Aquaculture Podcast Show on your favorite platform. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook to stay updated on the latest episodes and industry insights. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.